Christopher Robin, what exactly is doing nothing?
Well, I'm told it means going along, listening to all the things you can't hear, and not bothering.
Hello everybody, I am Reagan, and welcome back to the Pacific Northwest Studios and Productions 21st Century channel. And I remember the last time you guys saw me, I was explaining, how I moved into this house, in Issaquah, and also I'm actually going to tell you guys another story about what I did, back when I was a grizzly bear. And also, before I forget about this, I just want to say happy Martin Luther King Day, because I just know how important he was in American history. And actually, fun fact, back when I was a grizzly bear in the 1960s, I actually met Martin Luther King Jr., and I will tell all of you guys the story of how I met him. And then I also met John F. Kennedy as well, back when he was our president as well. And I'll tell you guys the story of like what happened, and also all the details, and also how I even got to Washington, D.C. to begin with. And anyway, the story of how I met both of those historical figures is I was basically in Leavenworth, and I went on this really big journey where I was going, where I was looking for fish, as usual, and then, I decided to go on this trip, and I started heading east, and so I was running a lot and moving in the forest, and I was trying to look for a lot of food, and I ate a lot of berries and everything like that. And then I passed a lot of states, as I as I was in the forest. And it's interesting because like a lot of different states like in America are very different from Washington State. Like in Minnesota, for example, you have a lot of cold weather, and then in North Dakota you also have different you just have flat land, and then of course once I got more and more east, that's where things really got a little bit more metropolitan like, and that's where I had to really hide, so I did so the animal control people didn't really see me and all that stuff. And so anyways, as I got to Washington D.C., I did really notice that it was really metropolitan, which means like there was a lot of people and there was a lot of cars, and I didn't want to get in contact, with humans, because then the humans would think, they would have this big, they just would assume, bears always like to eat humans, which is always not true. And so anyways, as I got to Washington D.C., I started looking like for a forest, to hide in. And when I got to a forest in Washington D.C., oh my goodness, it was probably one of the most beautiful forests, ever. Like there was a waterfall, there was trees, there was a lot of berries that I ate. There was even some blueberries and some blackberries, and I think I ate some strawberries as well. And there was also a lot of fish that was in the river as well. And so I also enjoyed, swimming in the river and all that stuff, and just catching a lot of fish, and so anyways, then as I was swimming in the river, I then got my little bear head out from the surface, and then I climbed out, and then there was this other trail, that led to somewhere. I didn't really know exactly where it led to, but I just know that I started, running, on the dirt, and started following the trail, and what happened is then one of the cliffs broke, and so then, I started falling down, and I started doing a bear roar, and so then I fell down, on the ground, and then I got myself up with my big bear paws, and then I saw this strange looking white house, and there was this garden or something that had a lot of roses around it, and then of course I started looking around with my bear eyes, and I was looking around. And then all of a sudden, I saw this really handsome looking guy that was sitting, at his desk, and I think he was like writing paper or something, and I don't know, like he had brown combed hair, and I think he had, and I think he was like with like his daughters, I believe, and I remember he was on the phone with somebody. I just didn't know who it was, and I didn't really know the exact full conversation that happened, but I remember, unfortunately I made a bear noise, and then I remember he said with his Boston accent, he was like, "What's outside? I wonder what is outside." And so anyway, then he came outside, and so I looked around, and unfortunately he got out a gun, and unfortunately me being very scared, I kind of hid behind the rocks, and so what happened was then he said, "Don't worry, I'm not gonna hurt you," and so I came out, and I made a bear noise, and what happened was then I started moving a little bit closer, and then I moved a little bit closer, and then all of a sudden the man started petting me on the head, and he was going like, "Oh, you're a nice little big fella. You are a big nice big fella," and then and so anyways and so then unfortunately me being pretty friendly, I also gave him a big lick, and so anyways I the man was actually pretty nice to me, and so he actually said, what, he was like, what, wait right here. And so then he got out a big piece of steak, and so he gave me a piece of steak, and so I started eating it, and I was going like, and I was going like, ah, and it was just like really, really good, and so anyway, then what happened was his Secret Service guards came in. I was like, and they were like, "Mr. President, is everything all right? And he's like, "Don't worry, everything is going all right, and so then from there, I went back into the forest, and and then I made a bear noise, and then I started going back into the forest. And then the man actually said, like, man, he said, wow, America is just so beautiful with its nature and also with its animals as well. And yeah, he had a very strong Boston accent, you know. And so then he went back into his office and he started doing more phone calls and all that stuff. And yeah, it was just very interesting meeting him. So anyway, I remained in Washington, D.C. for quite a bit of time, you know, and so I was there in the forest, and I think the forest that I was in was basically, I think, by the White House and Washington, D.C. and all that stuff, and so every time I was in the forest, I would go visit, America's 35th president, I believe, and I would visit him, and he would give me a lot of treats and give me a lot of, berries and steak. And there was even one time, he gave me a big pile of fish one time, and he was always pretty nice to me and all that stuff. But unfortunately, though, when I came back there one time, I noticed that he wasn't there, and unfortunately, I didn't know that about what happened to him until, days later, like when he got killed in Texas and all that stuff. And so, unfortunately, the president after him was unfortunately not very nice to me, and unfortunately, I never came back to the White House ever since. And so anyway, around one day in August, I believe, I was just kind of roaming around the forest, and all of a sudden, I saw all these people that were marching, in Washington, D.C., and they had a lot of signs that said things like freedom and all that stuff, and I didn't know exactly what was going on, but being very sneaky, I went through a lot of trails just to get to and I think the trail that I went on, in the forest led me to the Lincoln Memorial, I believe. And so then, I then saw this one gentleman, that had a suit on, and all of a sudden, he was making a speech, and I believe he was making, and I think the words in his speech was, "I have a dream," I believe. And so, he spoke, really well, and all the things that he said were pretty cool. And even though I was a grizzly bear, and unfortunately I'm not as smart as a human, and I didn't know exactly what was going on, I then laid down, on my bare paws, and I started listening, to the speech itself, and I really, and I was just relaxed, and I think I ate some berries as well, and so I listened to the speech, and I think the speech itself was, I believe, 17 minutes, I believe. It could have been even 20 minutes, but I think since I'm a bear, I don't know if I know my math very correctly, but anyways, and so anyway, then after the speech was all over, I then saw the same gentleman, and he was, I think he was like staying in a hotel, I believe, or something. And so I then went on another trail that led me to his exact hotel in Washington, D.C., and then I saw him writing a letter, I believe. I think he might have been writing a letter to his family, I think. And so I remember he did come outside, and he started looking at the moon, I believe. And then all of a sudden, I then broke out, out of a branch, I believe. And then, unfortunately, he got very scared when he saw him. He was like, "Oh, my God." And so then, he was like, "Oh, my God, there's a bear right there." And so then, and so I then got really scared. But then, I then went up to him very softly, and then I started, sniffing him, and going like, and so then, of course, right when he found out, I wasn't going to hurt him, he then started petting me, and he was going like, "Oh, you are such a nice bear," and so anyways, I got to spend some time with him, and he said to me, he's like, all of God's creation is very, very beautiful, and you are a very magnificent animal, and And so anyways, I got to spend some time with him that night, and of course, yeah, I really got to spend, some time with him. I didn't really know his name exactly, but he was a very nice man, and all that stuff. And so anyway, he then, and then he was like, and then he said to me, just wait right here. And so then I started looking around, and I think he had some beef jerky in his pocket, I believe. And then he gave it to me, and he was like, here, my man, you need these more than I do. And so then I started sniffing his hand, and then he gave me, some nice beef jerky, I believe, even though I know bears are not supposed to eat beef jerky and all that stuff. But the beef jerky that he gave me was pretty good. And then all of a sudden, that night, he started talking to me about a lot of different things. And unfortunately, as a bear, I didn't necessarily understand what he was talking about, and all that stuff, but it was just nice to talk, that he was talking to me. And then with my bear head, I just kept moving my head left and right, after each sentence, and then kept on nodding as well. And then right around midnight, I believe, he said to me, he said, well, it's midnight and it's getting late. I better want to get some sleep so I can go back home to Alabama. And I hope you also find your way home as well, Mr. Bear. And so I remember the man actually pet me on the head, and then I made a little bear noise. And so then I went back into the forest. And so anyways, I then went back into the forest, and so anyways, I think even though I didn't really understand, all the things he was talking about, he did say this one thing that was right, and the one message was there was no place like home, I believe, and so from there, I started, heading back to Leavenworth, Washington, and I went through all the states, I went through all the Midwest, and until I got home, and it was a very and as a bear, that was a very interesting trip that I went on, and I had to go through many different things as well, and the people that I met, those two humans, were very, very friendly people as well. And so anyway, then as I was going home, back to Leavenworth, a lot of chaos, started happening, in places like Chicago, and Detroit, and even though I don't really know the names of those states, but I just remember, in being in the forest in those places, and I remember, I remember, with my bare ears, I heard something on TV that the man that gave me all those snacks, back at his hotel room, unfortunately got killed, I believe. And there was a lot of people that were sad and all that stuff. And all of a sudden, there was a lot of chaos going around, and I remember just being so scared, even though I was a grizzly bear and I was so big, and I remember, a lot of people were just, destroying buildings and destroying cars, and there was a lot of, chaos and flames going around and rioting. And unfortunately, what was really sad were people were protesting, in the streets and everything. And, after, the man that gave me all those snacks was killed and all that stuff. And unfortunately, I was just so scared. And in my mind, I was going like, oh no, I better get out of here. Oh no. And so, then I started running, on my big bare feet, and just, getting out of there. And I was so scared. And then all of a sudden I started running out of energy because I didn't really eat enough fish, back when I was in Washington, D.C., by, the White House or the Lincoln Memorial, even though my memory is kind of fuzzy, and even though as a grizzly bear, I don't really remember a lot of things, But anyways, then as I got there, as I was in the forest, then I saw a car come by, and it was another man that looked just like America's 35th president, I believe. And I remember, I was just running in the streets on my big bare feet to the point where I didn't know where exactly I was going. And so then what happened was he was driving I believe, like with his wife, and then he also had a Boston accent as well, and he was going like, "Watch out!" And so then I remember his vehicle, started screeching, and I remember, being, so scared that I actually jumped on top of his car, and then and so I came out of his car, and unfortunately then I laid down, on my bare feet, and I was pretty sad that I destroyed his car, unfortunately, and I didn't unfortunately mean to, and but the good news though is that he had a cool Boston accent, just like America's 35th president, and he was like, "It's all right, it's okay, big fella. I didn't know you didn't mean to destroy my car," and so anyways, I then gave him a big bear hug as well, and I didn't know exactly where he was going. I think he was heading more east, I believe. I think he was heading to a state called Indiana, I believe, to make a speech in Indianapolis, I believe. And so anyways, even with the broken car, he was able to get there. And I remember, I tried to go back in the forest, as well. And then I started hearing his speech, hours later, about how the man that gave me all those treats, got killed and all that stuff. And so anyways, he was actually pretty nice as well. And unfortunately though, unfortunately I heard, back, as I was leaving, that, unfortunately it took me a lot of years to get back to Leavenworth, get back to Washington State, but unfortunately I did hear that he also got killed as well, I think, just like America's 35th president. And unfortunately, even though I was this big grizzly bear, and I'm supposed to be strong and all that stuff, unfortunately I did feel very sad that, a lot of people in this decade that I was in, were dying, like the man who gave me treats at his hotel room died. The man that used to be our president that gave me treats died. And then the person that I ran into back into Detroit that was friendly, he also unfortunately passed away. And so I just remember being very, very sad and all that stuff, And so then as I got home, back to my forest in Leavenworth, I was just very glad to be home. And I remember laying down in the grass, and I just remember thinking, that this decade that I was in, was just a very, very crazy time. And I just don't know if there's ever going to be a crazy time like that ever again. And so yeah, it was just very, very crazy. Like it truly was. And also as a bear, before I also met, my friend that I stay with now, before I met her, those three people I think were the first three humans that I met, as a grizzly bear. And yeah, I didn't know that they were American figures, after learning about it, decades and decades later, and yeah, it was just a very, very crazy time, very crazy decade it was. So anyway, you guys, that is the story of how I met Martin Luther King Jr., and it's also the story of how I met President Kennedy as well, and also met his brother Robert Kennedy too. And anyway, I really hope you guys really enjoyed this video, and I hope that you guys liked my story time video that I made. And I was really proud, even though today, unfortunately, I'm very, very tiny, and I'm a very, very tiny teddy bear and all that stuff, and I can't necessarily move a whole lot, or move around, like I did back when I was a grizzly bear. But if I'm very proud of one thing in particular, it was that I got to meet Martin Luther King Jr. And President Kennedy and Robert Kennedy as well, back in the 1960s. Even though the 1960s itself was a very crazy decade, and I was glad that I was able to escape, that part of of Washington, D.C. and all those other places, that I mentioned. And anyway, I hope all of you guys have a great and wonderful Martin Luther King Day. And I hope all of you guys enjoyed this video. And anyway, goodbye everybody. And I hope all of you guys have a very nice day as well.
At this time, I have the honor to present to you the moral leader of our nation. I have the pleasure to present to you Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr.
I am happy to join with you today in what will go down in history as the greatest demonstration for freedom in the history of our nation. Five score years ago, a great American in whose symbolic shadow we stand today signed the Emancipation Proclamation. This momentous decree came as a great beacon light of hope to millions of Negro slaves who had been seared in the flames of withering injustice. It came as a joyous daybreak to end the long night of their captivity. But 100 years later, the Negro still is not free. 100 years later, the life of the Negro is still sadly crippled by the manacles of segregation and the chains of discrimination. 100 years later, the Negro lives on a lonely island of poverty in the midst of a vast ocean of material prosperity. 100 years later, the Negro is still languished in the corners of American society and finds himself in exile in his own land. And so we've come here today to dramatize a shameful condition. In a sense, we've come to our nation's capital to cash a check. When the architects of our republic wrote the magnificent words of the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence, they were signing a promissory note to which every American was to fall heir. This note was a promise that all men, yes, black men as well as white men, would be guaranteed the unalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It is obvious today that America has defaulted on this promissory note insofar as her citizens of color are concerned. Instead of honoring this sacred obligation, America has given the Negro people a bad check, a check which has come back marked insufficient funds. But we refuse to believe that the Bank of Justice is bankrupt. We refuse to believe that there are insufficient funds in the great vaults of opportunity of this nation. So we've come to cash this check, a check that will give us upon demand the riches of freedom and the security of justice. We have also come to this hallowed spot to remind America of the fierce urgency of now. This is no time to engage in the luxury of cooling off or to take the tranquilizing drug of gradualism. Now is the time to make real the promises of democracy. Now is the time to rise from the dark and desolate valley of segregation to the sunlit path of racial justice. Now is the time to lift our nation from the quicksands of racial injustice to the solid rock of brotherhood. Now is the time to make justice a reality for all of God's children. It would be fatal for the nation to overlook the urgency of the moment. This sweltering summit of the Negro's legitimate discontent will not pass until there is an invigorating autumn of freedom and equality. 1963 is not an end, but a beginning. Those who hope that the Negro needed to blow off steam and will now be content will have a rude awakening if the nation returns to business as usual. There will be neither rest nor tranquility in America until the Negro is granted his citizenship rights. The whirlwinds of revolt will continue to shake the foundations of our nation until the bright day of justice emerges. But that is something that I must say to my people who stand on the warm threshold which leads into the palace of justice. In the process of gaining our rightful place, we must not be guilty of wrongful deeds. Let us not seek to satisfy our thirst for freedom by drinking from the cup of bitterness and hatred. We must forever conduct our struggle on the high plane of dignity and discipline. We must not allow our creative protests to degenerate into physical violence. Again and again, we must rise to the majestic heights of meeting physical force with soul force. The marvelous new militancy which has engulfed the Negro community must not lead us to a distrust of all white people. For many of our white brothers, as evidenced by their presence here today, have come to realize that their destiny is tied up with our destiny. And they have come to realize that their freedom is inextricably bound to our freedom. We cannot walk alone. And as we walk, we must make the pledge that we shall always march ahead. We cannot turn back. There are those who are asking the devotees of civil rights, when will you be satisfied? We can never be satisfied as long as the Negro is the victim of the unspeakable horrors of police brutality. We can never be satisfied as long as our body is heavy with the fatigue of travel. cannot gain lodging in the motels of the highways and the hotels of the cities. We cannot be satisfied as long as the Negro's basic mobility is from a smaller ghetto to a larger one. We can never be satisfied as long as our children are stripped of their selfhood and robbed of their dignity by signs stating for whites only. We cannot be satisfied as long as a Negro in Mississippi cannot vote and a Negro in New York believes he has nothing for which to vote. No, we are not satisfied, and we will not be satisfied until justice rolls down like waters and righteousness like a mighty stream. I am not unmindful that some of you have come here out of great trials and tribulations. Some of you have come fresh from narrow jail cells. Some of you have come from areas where your quest for freedom left you battered by the storms of persecution and staggered by the winds of police brutality. You have been the veterans of creative suffering. Continue to work with the faith that unearned suffering is redemptive. Go back to Mississippi. Go back to Alabama. Go back to South Carolina. Go back to Georgia. Go back to Louisiana. Go back to the slums and ghettos of our northern cities. Knowing that somehow this situation can and will be changed. Let us not wallow in the valley of despair. I say to you today, my friend, so even though we face the difficulties of today and tomorrow, I still have a dream. It is a dream deeply rooted in the American dream. I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. I have a dream that one day on the red hills of Georgia, the sons of former slaves and the sons of former slave owners will be able to sit down together at the table of brotherhood. I have a dream that one day, even the state of Mississippi, a state sweltering with the heat of injustice, sweltering with the heat of oppression, will be transformed into an oasis of freedom and justice. I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. I have a dream today. I have a dream that one day, down in Alabama, with its vicious racists, with its governor having his lips dripping with the words of interposition and nullification, one day right there in Alabama, little black boys and black girls will be able to join hands with little white boys and white girls as sisters and brothers. I have a dream today. I have a dream that one day every valley shall be exalted. And every hill and mountain shall be made low, the rough places will be made plain, and the crooked places will be made straight, and the glory of the Lord shall be revealed, and all flesh shall see it together. This is our hope. This is a faith that I go back to the South with. With this faith, we will be able to hew out of the mountain of despair a stone of hope. With this faith, we will be able to transform the jangling discords of our nation into a beautiful symphony of brotherhood. With this faith, we will be able to work together, to pray together, to struggle together, to go to jail together, to stand up for freedom together, knowing that we will be free one day. This will be the day. This will be the day when all of God's children will be able to sing with new meaning, "My country, tears of thee. Sweet land of liberty, of thee I sing. Land where my fathers died, land of the pilgrim's pride. From every mountainside, let freedom ring. And if America is to be a great nation, this must become true. And so let freedom ring from the prodigious hilltops of New Hampshire. Let freedom ring from the mighty mountains of New York. Let freedom ring from the heightening Alleghanies of Pennsylvania. Let freedom ring from the snow-capped Rockies of Colorado. Let freedom ring from the curvaceous slopes of California. But not only that, let freedom ring from Stone Mountain of Georgia. Let freedom ring from Lookout Mountain of Tennessee. Let freedom ring from every hill and molehill of Mississippi, from every mountainside. Let freedom ring, and when this happens, and when we allow freedom ring, when we let it ring from every village and every hamlet, from every state and every city, we will be able to speed up that day when all of God's children, black men and white men, Jews and Gentiles, Protestants and Catholics, will be able to join hands and sing in the words of the old Negro spiritual, "Free at last, free at last. Thank God Almighty, we are free at last."